And welcome back. It's Jason Walter here. I want to spend some time today to talk about what the Fed is doing right now and how that's going to be impacting our housing market. And I actually found a very interesting article that was posted by the Chief Economist at the National Association of Home Builders. And they just posted this a couple weeks ago, but they gave some really good insight about what the Fed is doing right now and how that's going to be impacting our housing market. So with that said, let's go ahead and dive right into this video here. Again, this was posted about 2 weeks ago on the 15th of June. And this is, of course, is from Robert Dietz, who is the Chief Economist at the National Association of Home Builders. And by the way, he has a PhD in economics from Ohio State University. So what he's basically saying right here is that obviously we have persistent inflation. Obviously, it's not transitory like the Fed told us a few months ago. But the inflation right now is basically at 40-year highs, approximately 8.6% as of May. And so the Fed is trying to fight inflation right now by cooling off demand. But what he says here is that this is the Fed's failure to fix underlying supply side challenges, because what we're seeing right now is a lack of houses for sale, and that's causing home prices to increase greatly and also rents to increase greatly as well. However, though, the Fed is looking to combat demand and also trying to cool off demand in order to decrease inflation. And he goes on to say the following here. The Fed lacks policy tools to make these supply side fixes, so it must rely on demand side impacts to bring down inflation by reducing economic growth. So what he's saying here is that the Fed is aiming at controlling inflation by cooling off demand. So if they cool off demand, inflation is going to be decreasing. However, though, he's saying that the issues we're having, at least in the housing sector, is a supply side issue, and the Fed does not have these tools to fix the supply side fixes. And he says here at the conclusion of the Fed's June meeting, of course, the Fed raised the federal funds rate by 75 basis points, and of course, this was the largest increase since 1994. And in looking ahead here through 2023, the Fed is looking at an additional 205 basis point rate hike. It says here the Fed is likely to continue to raise the target rate, in other words, the federal funds rate, at each meeting by 50 basis points or more. The Fed's target is a 2% inflation rate. So Robert Dietz here, which again is the chief economist at the National Association of Realtors, is calling for the Fed to increase the federal funds rate by 50 basis points in each of their meetings here. And by the way, the next meeting by the Fed is actually in 4 weeks from now. They're meeting on July 27th. Then they're meeting again September 21st, November 2nd, and then December 14th. So this is what's called the Fed Rate Monitor Tool. It's on investing.com. So if you just Google Fed Rate Monitor Tool on investing.com, you'll see this. So they basically provide projections about what they feel the Fed is going to be doing in each of their meetings regarding the federal funds rate. So right now, again, the upper range at the federal funds rate right now is 1.75%. So according to this tool here, there's an 88.5% probability that the Fed is going to be increasing rates by 50 basis points up to an upper range of 2.5%. And in their meeting on September 21st, they're also calling for a 50 basis point rate hike of a probability of that of 85%. And the probability of another 50 basis rate hike on November 2nd is only a probability of 48.7%. But then in their December meeting, they're only calling for the rate to basically be flat for the year or to only increase by 25 basis points. So in regards about how the federal funds rate is correlated with mortgage rates, I'm going to be talking about that here in just a little bit. But first, let's talk about the balance sheet of the Fed. It says, of course, the Fed plans to reduce its balance sheet, which includes, of course, mortgage-backed securities. They plan to reduce that by $35 billion worth of MBSs per month. So what he's basically saying here is that in the June meeting, the Fed basically confirmed their existing plan of reducing their mortgage-backed securities by $35 billion. And it says the lack of change for this balance sheet reduction is actually a positive element in the housing market. And it says here there was a risk of a planned faster pace. So in other words, if the Fed had pivoted and said, hey, we're going to be reducing our mortgage-backed securities or our balance sheet by more than $35 billion, that could have caused an increase in mortgage rates. And Robert Dietz went on to say the following here. He says, of course, we had 6 straight months of declines of home builder sentiment. Builder confidence has declined for 6 consecutive months. And therefore, this is a clear risk that the Fed is falling behind on the curve. The Fed will overshoot on tightening and bring on a recession as it fights inflation. So the chief economist at the National Association of Home Builders is calling for a recession as the Fed fights inflation. And he says here, this would not be a soft landing the Fed is attempting to orchestrate. Indeed, the National Association of Home Builders economic forecast now includes a 2023 recession. He says here they are calling for a GDP outlook for 2023 at 1.7%. Of course, that's the Fed's projection for 2023. And it says here this will be very difficult to achieve. It says here the Fed's unemployment projection sees a rate increasing to 4.1% through 2024. And he says here the increase in the unemployment rate would qualify to a step towards a recession. He also touches on the Fed's projections for inflation because the Fed is projecting that inflation is going to be declining through 2024. We will have to see about that. So the Fed is basically calling for a 4.3% inflation rate for 2022, then 2.7% in 2023, and then falling again to 2.3% in 2024. However, though, he says this is going to be difficult to achieve. And the reason for this is from a lagged impact on inflation from increasing residential rents, which materialize in inflation readings on a lagged basis when leases are renewed. So in other words, one of the key inflation readings that the Fed looks at, of course, is the core PCE, and a large percentage of that is coming from residential rents. However, though, rising rents is a lagging indicator because increasing rents is materialized when people renew their leases. And it says here, tightening interest rate conditions can affect supply, not just demand. So he says here, higher rates are due to a lack of housing supply, and higher mortgage rates will make it more difficult to finance the development of additional housing supply. So in other words, because the Fed is basically tightening demand, of course, that's causing mortgage rates to increase. And when, of course, mortgage rates increase, that makes it more difficult to build more houses and also to build apartment buildings as well. If we want to see inflation decrease, at least from the form of residential rents, but when the Fed increases the federal funds rate, that has an indirect effect of increasing mortgage rates, which de-incentivizes builders in order to build more houses. And thus, because of this, we have a lack of houses for sale, and therefore that causes inflation to get even worse. So in regards to the federal funds rate and how that impacts mortgage rates, have a look at this. Here's a great graphic showing the average 30-year fixed rate mortgage ever since 2007. And here's the federal funds rate. So have a look at this from basically November 2015 with a top rate of just 0.25%. Because if you guys remember, the federal funds rate was basically 0% from 2009 all the way until 2016 or 2015. So in November 2015, the federal funds rate was 0.25% on the upper range. And then in November 2018, it increased to 2.5%, a 225 basis point rate hike. But during this time period when the federal funds rate increased by 225 basis points, we didn't see the same increase in mortgage rates. So mortgage rates increased by a smaller amount. They went from 3.9% in November 2015 to just under 4.9% by November 2018. So in other words, even though the federal funds rate increased by 225 basis points, the average 30-year fixed only increased by 100 basis points. So the federal funds rate is tied very loosely to mortgage rates. When we have decreases in the federal funds rate, that can cause decreases in mortgage rates, but there's no guarantees regarding that. Instead, have a look at the yield on the 10-year US Treasury note because that's tied more directly to mortgage rates than anything else. All right, so going back to this article here, it says clearly elevated inflation readings call for a normalization of monetary policy by the Fed. It says here, though, however, fiscal and regulatory policies must complement monetary policies as part of this adjustment, though. Yet many of these measures are simply beyond the Fed's control. So what I think he means here is reducing red tape and regulations in order to build more houses. So I actually found an interesting article about this. Here is also according to the National Association of Home Builders. This is an article that was posted a couple of days ago here. It says here that they actually did a research effort or a joint research effort with the Builders Association and also the National Multifamily Housing Council. And they actually did this to find out how much government regulation adds to the cost of building new multifamily properties here. It says on average 40.6% of total development costs can now be attributed to complying with regulations imposed by all levels of government. And it says here the highest average cost is a result of changes in building codes over the past 10 years. That represents 11.1% of total development costs. So that represents right here the part of the 40.6%, again 11.1% for changes in building codes over the past 10 years. Also, 8.5% represents costs when site work begins, such as fees and required studies, for example. And here's a really good summary regarding this. It says regulations cover a wide range of issues, and while they may not be well-intentioned, the costs and burdens of any regulation must be carefully weighed against the benefits. So obviously we need basic safety standards for structures as well as workers as well. It says here though, but when regulation constitutes an average of 40.6% of a project's development cost, this raises questions about how thoroughly governments are considering the consequences of their actions. And going back to this original article about the Fed here, here's what they are summarizing here. It says higher inflation in housing is due to a lack of rental and for sale inventory. I would add it's also due to record low mortgage rates as well that we saw in 2020 and also in 2021. But he's on point here because he says higher interest rates will not produce more lumber. Also, a smaller balance sheet will not increase the production of appliances and materials. In short, while the Fed can cool the demand side of this economy, reducing inflation and growth, of course, additional output on the supply side, in other words, we need more houses to be built, is required in order to tame the growth in costs that we're seeing in the housing market. And efficient regulatory policy, in particular, can help achieve this goal and fight inflation. So what do you guys think about this article here? I found it to be very interesting. They're basically taking a jab at the Fed saying, hey, you guys are reducing the demand side, but it's really the supply side we need help with in order to tame this housing market. So comment below with your biggest takeaways from today's video. Also, if you got any value of today's video whatsoever, then please hit the like button and greatly appreciate that. Hope you guys have an awesome day and look forward to seeing you on the next video.